I want to start this video out by saying that it genuinely makes me sad that I had to do this. But between the latest mediocre expansion and all the happenings at Blizzard, I just couldn't bring myself to enjoy World of Warcraft anymore. Which is weird to say out loud because I still do love this game. But even throughout this video, let me be clear that you can like either of these games, or both, and I do think that each is at least worth trying out in the first place. Now, to give a little bit of context, I started playing WoW at the start of Battle for Azeroth. I had just gotten a good PC and I had heard the stories of the king of all MMORPGs. Clearly, I didn't look into it that much because that's not the case anymore and hasn't for a while. Regardless, I still loved it. World of Warcraft was still fun, and hell, even now I still think there is still a degree of fun to be had. But it's no secret that the game is not in its best state right now and hasn't been for years. Final Fantasy XIV also exists, and I'm gonna be honest, I knew of this game's existence for the longest time, but I never gave it a second thought because I never heard anyone else talking about it before Asmongold did. This game just seems so niche despite the wild popularity of Final Fantasy. And even though I still love WoW, it has lost its magic, and I was one of many people that migrated to Final Fantasy to give it a shot. And long story short, I freaking hated it. Yeah, at first I could not stand it at all. The game looked nice, but it did not have the timeless style that WoW had. Combat felt slow, questing felt like a slog, but I also didn't give it a real chance from the get-go. Maybe it was because I didn't want to change. I'd already put so much time into WoW that I didn't want it to be a waste. But after a while, I started to get tired of the grind for World of Warcraft. Torghast was becoming an issue, and honestly, I just ran out of fun things to do in the game. So I canceled my subscription and decided to give Final Fantasy XIV a real shot. So I got the new expansion, renewed my subscription, and then proceeded to go into the game with an open mind with WoW behind me. And after playing for a while, I realized something. My opinion of these two games has changed. But before I go further, I do want to recognize the things that I do still like WoW for, and there is a lot to it. I already mentioned this, but WoW is a game that never really looked bad. Games like TF2 and most Mario platformers are made in a way that make them look good even years later. They don't really age. World of Warcraft also shares this trait. Even going back to the older areas untouched by the Cataclysm world polishes, it still looks very nice, even with the obvious graphical downgrades. Final Fantasy looks nice, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend that some areas look a bit more aged than others. Another thing are the factions. The premise of having two factions that are at absolute war all the time, even to the point where you can't even step foot in the opposing faction's capital city, has a bit of magic to it. It makes the choice of alliance or horde seem impactful, like you're choosing a country, a home to represent both in and outside of game. Even if you have characters on both factions, there's a level of pride that comes with it. And just in case you're wondering, horde is superior. Final Fantasy has its factions, but it feels a lot less important, as World of Warcraft was like, for the horde, hell yeah! And Final Fantasy is just kind of, I chose the yellow one. This could be because WoW gatekeeps content from the other faction to give it a real sense of importance. However, after they added cross-faction activities, this is effectively nullified to a degree. World of Warcraft also feels connected. No loading between zones, and it feels very natural to travel, even though some areas are empty, but I still like this more than the segregated areas of Final Fantasy. Although I will say that the later areas do get much bigger, so it's a lot less noticeable. Now, my last positive that WoW has over Final Fantasy is that you get to keep your retinas. WoW was made to raid, so all the spell effects are fairly minimal. This is what Final Fantasy looks like. I don't think I need to explain much else, but that's about it, and now to the real meat. I believe that in an MMO, there are only 3 core parts after you break it down into its rawest form. The grind, the endgame, and the community. Now, these are very, very broad terms, but both games approach these differently even though they walk the same general path. First, the grind. This is arguably the biggest part of most MMOs. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that go into the grind, the combat, questing, how much of it you need to do, and if the rewards are worth it, and I could go on. I'm not going to go too much into combat for these games, because they are very similar. While I do like the lower global cooldowns of World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy does feel more active. It feels similar to playing Fire Mage in World of Warcraft if you've done that before. Melee classes have skills that combo into each other to streamline the rotations, while also having to juggle self-buffing skills. Another thing that adds to this feeling is, well, JoCat said it best.
Everybody is a DPS!
Yes, every class, no matter their role, has high damage potential, which means that leveling up as a tank or healer is not nearly as big as a chore as it was in WoW. Plus, in this game, playing a tank is actually pretty fun. I personally play Gunbreaker, which is a healthy bridge between damage and tank. Plus, with tanking being as streamlined as it is, with you just needing to activate your tank stance to increase aggro, it's basically a more beefy DPS and it makes playing a lot more fun. Next is questing. I'm not gonna sit here and say one is better than the other because they're not. They're both good and bad in their own way. World of Warcraft is, well, fast. Their quests are fairly repetitive, but they can get done fairly fast, and it also doesn't have that much dialogue. Final Fantasy on the exact opposite of the spectrum. There is a significantly larger variety of quests that you can do in Final Fantasy, which is great and all, but that is completely halted by the constant dialogue and cutscenes, especially with the story quests. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but I think the story is good enough to where if you really wanted to pay attention, it won't feel nearly as slow, but if you're impatient like me, it does kind of bog down the experience a little bit. But aside from that, there's also fates, which are just small random happenings going on in the open world that you can just jump into and help out. It definitely makes roaming around and traveling from point A to point B much more interesting, and it rewards some pretty hefty XP too. Dungeons are there too, and they're pretty fun, much faster than World of Warcraft dungeons, with a loot system that's okay, but not much different than that. Next is the endgame, which is the other big half that needs to be done right and able to retain players. WoW's endgame is pretty much just raiding and grinding for even more gear and mount. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. WoW raids are some of the best experiences that I've had in an online game. I'm also not going to sit here and pretend that it can't get a little bit stale. However, Final Fantasy has a lot of endgame activities, including raids. Player housing, character customization, very, very large character customization, I add, leveling the other classes you might want to play, which, by the way, is all on one character, so you can level new classes with an EXP boost based on your highest level class, which makes leveling alternate classes so much faster. There's also the Golden Saucer, which has its own subcategories: Chocobo Breeding and Racing, Lord of Vermilion, Fashion Reports, Gates, Triple Triad, and all of these have their own level of depth in them with their own grinds that's actually really fun to engage with. I haven't really played much of the others, but Triple Triad is definitely my favorite activity. It's basically a grid-based card game that's been in Final Fantasy for a while, and not only is it in here, it's also built into the entire game as well. There are over 300 cards to collect, and NPCs around the world will play with you and sometimes even reward you with more cards. PvP is also an activity best enjoyed in the endgame, though I haven't touched it in either of these games, but I will say that WoW PvP definitely feels more important because of the two factions, as that's really the only interaction that you have with opposing faction players, which I admittedly liked. PvP is serviceable in Final Fantasy, but I would not say that it's the best possible option. This variety in the endgame makes it easy to try something fresh. Plus, swapping classes is easy, and leveling is really fast after you've maxed out your first character. It's a good experience, and this is just one thing that WoW just doesn't have: variety. While its raids are the best in the genre, it's much better than Final Fantasy's raids, but it's really not much more than that. And the last core element of an MMORPG is the community that surrounds it. And I'm sorry, World of Warcraft is just kinda toxic. Of course, I speak of the loud minority of players, but it is hell to spend an hour in a raid just to wipe and then half the group just leaves or screams about how it's the tank or healer's fault. It's just not fun to interact with other players. Final Fantasy is not immune to this, but I will say it's much better. I've had no bad experiences, even if I was the reason that we wiped in a dungeon. I think that the new player system helps. Basically, you're labeled with a sprout next to your name to show that you're new and might not understand all the dungeon mechanics, which is a small thing that I'm sure a lot of people appreciate, myself included. Now, of these two games, I wish I could recommend World of Warcraft. I really do. This game means so much to so many people, and it's a shame that this is what the game has become. I know I went hard on it, but I miss World of Warcraft, and I want it back. But in its current state, I just can't recommend it to anyone. And until something changes, I'm gonna stick with Final Fantasy, because this is the MMO experience that I wanted back. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm on the Geneva server, by the way, just in case any of y'all wanted to play, and I will see you all on the next video.